The most important system in the Middle Ages was the feudal system, also known as manorialism. And this was a political system. It's how the different communities were organized, but also affected their society, how their social interactions took place, and also the economy of the community. Feudalism is an interdependent system. Keep that word in mind, interdependent, meaning that everybody is relying on one another. So it's going to be a system of political ties where nobles give land to lesser nobles in return for loyalty and services. So following this system was how people began to have different ranks in the society, and also how some people gained more and more power. There were three different levels of nobles in the society. The top level was the king. Then came lords, and there were ranks of the different types of lords as well. If you've ever heard of a duke or a baron or an earl, those are different levels of lords. And then later the knights, which we had talked about, began under Charlemagne. So an example of how this would work. A noble who had more power and had land will give a piece of land called a fief to a lesser noble. For example, the king, in order to get some service from the lord, might give the lord some land. In return, the lord is now going to provide knights and arms to protect the king, who is the higher noble. So you would gain a piece of land, but in return, you had to provide service and protection to the person who gave you the land. But this was how people began to rise in society. For example, a lord, this middle rank here, might have such a large amount of land that he could afford to give some away. So if he had a knight who had done a good job of fighting for him, he might give the knight some land. So knights could gain power and rank in society by giving good service to their lord, who might give them some land. Here's how the system would work. At the top would be the king, and the king would give the land, called a fief, to the lord. But in return, the lords had to be loyal to the king. Then the lord might also give land to the knights, who would again give protection in the form of loyalty in the form of protection to the lord. So let's say the king of France gets into a conflict with the king of Spain. He's going to get a message to his lords and say, I need you to come help me out. I gave you land, and now it's your turn to come and pay up. So the lords would then go grab their knights, who had also been given some land or a place to live, and they all would go and fight for the king. Now at the bottom of this system are the peasants, and the peasants are people who do not have any land. Some of them are free, some of them are not. They are the people who in this system are going to provide food for everyone at the higher rank. They get to live on this land, and they also receive protection from the knights and the lord in return for their food. Unfortunately for the peasants, they don't have a lot of status in life, and their life does not have any opportunity to move up into a higher status like a knight. So there is some social mobility or power that can transfer between the kings, lords, and knights. But most peasants would be born a peasant and stay a peasant, and most people were peasants. So the center of this community is the fief, and that is a manor, and it's going to include a castle or a very large home, which is not so much just a place for people to live, but also a place of protection. Then there's going to be the surrounding farmland where the peasants will work, and the village where in very basic homes the peasants will live, and then each community had its own church. As I mentioned before, most people were peasants in the community. The free peasants, this is a smaller number of them, could rent the land and work on the manor. They did have some freedom. They didn't usually move from one manor to another, but they would have that ability if they felt like they were having a hard life there. They could move to a different manor, but most of the time they stayed in the same place. The next group are the group called the serfs. And the serfs, not smurfs, serfs, are the main peasants, and they are unfree, and they are bound to the land. So they're almost in a system like slavery, but they were not considered slaves. They would be required to work on the land. They got to live there for free. There's no rent, but in return for living on the land, they do have to provide a portion of their food that they have grown. Now, serfs didn't own the land, but they got protection from the nobles. So there, as I mentioned before, it was an interdependent system. This is an interdependent system, so everybody has a part to play in keeping the community safe and well fed. This is an image of the manor from the time, so you can see that there's the big vast castle. There's a wall protecting it in case another community invades, and then surrounding is the farmland. So the manor house sometimes would have just been a simple home, sometimes it would have been a vast castle, but it always would have had some form of protection around it in case there was any wars going around, the people would be able to travel in. The village would contain the serfs and also sometimes the peasants' homes. They would be very much a self-sufficient community. So they'd have a workshop with a blacksmith, they'd even have a mill to be able to grind up their grain. There might be a community barn where all the different animals would be, and there would be usually 3 fields. 2 would be used each season, and a 3rd would be allowed to rest, making it more productive. And then, of course, the church is going to be a central part of each community. So each of these little manors is like a small town. So the people who are in charge, the kings or monarchs, rule by divine right, which means that they believed that the Christian God that they believed in gave them the right to be in power, and therefore their power should not be questioned. These kings would live in even bigger castles, and then sometimes high-ranking nobles would also have castles. These castles were basically nice forts because there was a lot of warfare during this time. Castles, as mentioned before, were a fort, and so they're a military technology and they're built for defense. They're usually going to have a tall wall, sometimes even a moat. They are usually built with stone walls so that they're very, very strong. They have few windows so that there would be fewer places for an invading person to be able to try and get in through. And the few windows they had would be very, very small. This is not the castle of a fairy princess in Disney World that you might think of from a Disney movie. These were cold, damp places to live. They're not the types of palaces you think you might want to live in. A medieval castle was a pretty tough place to live. They were cold, damp, dark, and smoky because they had the fires to keep them warm, but not a lot of windows to let the fire out. So here is an example of what a castle would have looked like. They were usually made of stone, often on a hill, because that gives you better protection when someone's invading to be able to shoot down at them if you need to. Here is an example of how this would be set up. So they'd sometimes have a moat and then just one point of entry here to make it difficult to get in. And if they had windows, they would be higher up and usually quite small. Now in the peasant life, they would live in small dwellings outside of the castle walls, and in the event of an invasion, they would come into those walls that were shown before. They often had a straw roof and a dirt floor. These were not fancy places to live. And farm animals even would live inside the home. So this is not a place that has a lot of hygiene. It is a bit smellier than what we would have thought of, especially during the Roman times. A very simple type of lifestyle for them.